write these songs that are, I think, kind of confessional sometimes, or revealing, and I have all these people who go, thank you, it's songs about me.
For decades, Richard Marx was the voice behind the anthems of love and heartbreak, his songs filling wedding halls, radio charts, and teenage mixtapes. He was untouchable, a poster child of romance with a voice that defined an era. But the years that followed were anything but picture perfect. Behind the smooth choruses lay battles with the industry, personal upheavals, and choices that threatened to dismantle the very image that made him famous. Every glance in the spotlight showed a polished star. Every whisper behind the curtain hinted at a man fighting to hold on. Until now. At 61, Richard Marx steps forward once again, and what he reveals and how he looks today is leaving even his most loyal fans in disbelief. This isn't just a comeback. It's the stunning transformation of a legend you thought you already knew. In the late 1980s, a storm swept through the world of pop and rock, and its name was Richard Marx. He wasn't the snarling, leather-clad bad boy of the MTV era. He wasn't a punk rebel or a glitter-soaked glam rocker. He was something far more dangerous, an unassuming boy-next-door crooner who made millions of people believe in love again. His voice was velvet, but behind that silky sound was a relentless ambition that had been brewing since childhood. Born in Chicago in 1963, Richard grew up surrounded by music. His father, Dick Marx, was a jazz pianist and jingle writer, and his mother was a singer. Music wasn't just in the household, it was the household. By the time most kids were struggling through high school, Richard was already writing songs that made seasoned producers pause and wonder if this teenager had tapped into something bigger than himself. But no one could have predicted the meteoric rise that was coming. At just 18, he sent a tape of his songs to Lionel Richie, who, impressed, invited him to Los Angeles. That single connection turned into a stepping stone toward destiny. Richard didn't land a solo career immediately. He paid his dues, singing background vocals for some of the biggest names in the business, including Lionel himself, Madonna, and Whitney Houston. Yet, the kid wasn't satisfied being a shadow. He wanted center stage. In 1987, he got it. His self-titled debut album didn't just perform well, it exploded. Singles like Don't Mean Nothing and Should Have Known Better dominated the charts, introducing the world to a new kind of rock-pop star. By the time his second album, Repeat Offender, came out in 1989, Richard was no longer just climbing. He was ruling. Right Here Waiting became one of the biggest ballads of the decade, a song so powerful that people played it at weddings, funerals, graduations, and heartbreaks. It wasn't just a hit, it was a soundtrack to people's lives. But with fame came expectation. Suddenly, Richard wasn't just Richard Marx. He was the balladeer, the man who could sing your heartbreak better than you could feel it yourself. And while the world swooned, the pressure behind the scenes mounted. Critics sneered at his sincerity, rock purists mocked his softness, and even industry insiders whispered that Marx's stardom would burn bright, but fast. What they didn't know was that Richard Marx was a fighter. He had built himself from the ground up, and he wasn't going to let anyone write his ending for him. The 1990s would test that resolve in ways no one expected. His voice had made him a star, but his choices, the risks, the scandals, the secrets, would determine whether he stayed one. It was the kind of love story tabloids dream about, the rising rock star and the television darling. In 1989, just as his fame was peaking, Richard Marx married Cynthia Rhodes, the actress and dancer who had charmed audiences in Dirty Dancing and Flashdance. To the outside world, it looked like perfection. She was glamorous. He was the sensitive hitmaker. And together, they embodied the fantasy of Hollywood romance. But behind that sparkling image was a dynamic few truly understood. Cynthia was already an established star when they met, while Richard was still clawing his way up. Their worlds collided in a whirlwind, and within a few years, she stepped away from the spotlight entirely. She left her career behind to raise their 3 children, while Richard toured the globe. The press painted it as noble, selfless, and traditional. But whispers in Hollywood suggested otherwise. Some insiders claimed Cynthia sacrificed too much, that she abandoned her ambitions for his. Others said she resented the endless tours, the screaming fans, the women who hung around backstage waiting for a chance to be noticed. For a long time, neither spoke of the strain, but the cracks began to show. While Richard poured himself into his music, Cynthia was left to manage the chaos at home. Their marriage lasted 25 years, a rare feat in Hollywood, but not without scars. The truth came out in 2014, when the couple announced their quiet divorce. There was no public mudslinging, no fiery accusations, but those close to them whispered of years of distance, of love that had cooled under the weight of careers, family, and time. The man who had written the most iconic love ballads of the century had lost his own great romance. For Richard, it was more than a personal tragedy. It was a public irony. Fans who had believed in every lyric of Endless Summer Nights suddenly questioned whether he had been singing lies all along. Yet even as he weathered heartbreak, Richard refused to crumble. He channeled the pain into new music, new performances, and eventually into a second chance at love. But that second chance came with its own firestorm of gossip and disbelief. Richard Marx wasn't just a singer, he was a machine. In an era when pop idols came and went like disposable fads, Richard proved himself different. He wasn't satisfied with being a face on a magazine cover or a voice on a ballad. He wanted to be a force in the industry. And for nearly a decade, he was unstoppable. From 1987 to 1994, Richard scored a string of hits that solidified his place in music history. He became the first solo artist to have his first 7 singles hit the top 5 on the Billboard charts. 7. That feat placed him alongside giants like the Beatles and Madonna. The kid who had once carried coffee for producers was now rewriting the rules of pop success. But the real twist in Richard's rise was his versatility. He wasn't confined to one sound. He could deliver aching ballads like Hold On to the Nights and Right Here Waiting, then pivot to harder-edged rock anthems like Satisfied. His concerts weren't just shows. They were mass emotional exorcisms, with thousands of fans singing along, crying, screaming, believing. Still, success came at a cost. The more hits he produced, the more he was expected to deliver. Record executives demanded chart toppers. Fans demanded love songs that would gut them. And critics demanded failure. They wanted proof that Richard Marx was just another manufactured star whose time would run out. But Richard had a weapon few saw coming: his pen. Behind the microphone, he was also one of the most prolific songwriters of his generation. He penned tracks for legends like Barbra Streisand, Luther Vandross, and even NSYNC. His songwriting royalties alone were enough to make him a fortune, long after his own chart dominance began to wane. The boyish heartthrob had become something more enduring: a hitmaker, a craftsman, an architect of sound. But as Richard Marx conquered the charts, another battle was brewing, one that wouldn't be fought in studios or arenas. It would be fought in private, in whispers, in shadows. Because fame, as he would learn, doesn't just build you up, it waits patiently to tear you apart. For years, Richard Marx was the industry's golden boy. He was polished, professional, and squeaky clean in an era when scandal fueled careers. But in Hollywood, the spotlight burns through veneers, and Richard's carefully crafted image began to show its cracks. Behind the curtain, Richard was far from the flawless heartthrob fans imagined. He was a perfectionist, driven by an almost obsessive need to control every note, every performance, every lyric. Band members whispered of grueling rehearsals that stretched into the early hours of the morning. Studio engineers recalled him re-recording the same line over and over, sometimes until his voice bled. He wanted greatness, and he would accept nothing less. But that ambition had consequences. Rumors began swirling that Richard could be difficult, even ruthless, with those who failed to meet his standards. A former tour manager once described working with him as walking on eggshells. Even those who admired his talent admitted that behind the charm and soft smile was a fire that could scorch anyone who stood in his way. Then came the darker whispers. While Richard's marriage to Cynthia Rhodes appeared picture-perfect, Hollywood insiders claimed all was not as it seemed. Long tours meant long separations. Long separations meant temptation. And temptation is Hollywood's oldest trick. Though Richard has never admitted to infidelity, speculation swirled around backstage encounters, adoring fans, and late nights on the road. For a man who built his career singing of eternal devotion, the idea of betrayal struck a chord that many didn't want to believe, but couldn't ignore. Financial disputes also stained his otherwise spotless record. Lawsuits between Marx and former managers quietly played out in legal backrooms, disputes over royalties, contracts, and control. He fought for ownership of his music, refusing to let executives exploit the songs that had come from his soul. To some, this made him a hero. To others, it made him a stubborn egotist, unwilling to compromise. By the mid-1990s, the hits slowed. Grunge had taken over. Ballads were dismissed as dated. And suddenly, Richard Marx was no longer the chart-dominating star he had been. To the public, he was fading gracefully. But behind the curtain, he was fighting tooth and nail to remain relevant, to remind the world he wasn't just a voice from another era. The man who once seemed untouchable was about to discover how brutal the industry could be once it decides you've had your time. And worse, the same public who once adored him was about to feast on his pain. Every star has a moment when the spotlight turns into a searchlight, exposing the very things they hoped to keep hidden. For Richard Marx, that moment came not from music, but from his personal life. In 2014, after 25 years of marriage, Richard and Cynthia Rhodes announced their divorce. It was quiet, almost clinical, with statements of mutual respect and amicable separation. But Hollywood wasn't buying it. A love story that had seemed so pure, so enduring, had suddenly collapsed, and fans demanded to know why. Speculation spread like wildfire. Some pointed to Richard's relentless touring schedule. Others whispered about Cynthia's growing resentment over abandoning her career. But the most damaging rumors accused Richard of straying, of living the life of a rock star when he was supposed to be a devoted husband and father. No evidence ever surfaced, but in Hollywood, the absence of proof is never the absence of belief. Tabloids had a field day. "The Balladeer's broken home," screamed one headline. Another cruelly asked, "Did the man who sang Right Here Waiting stop waiting for his wife?" For an artist whose image was built on love songs and romantic devotion, the irony was brutal. His very identity was under attack. The divorce also cracked open his finances. With 3 children and decades of shared assets, the split wasn't just emotional, it was costly. Richard, once celebrated for his perfect life, was suddenly portrayed as a man scrambling to keep control of both his career and his fortune. And then came the public backlash. On social media, fans turned his lyrics into weapons, quoting lines from his most famous ballads to mock the collapse of his marriage. For a man who had poured his heart into songs that millions used as the soundtrack of their love stories, the ridicule was devastating. But Richard was not a man to bow down to humiliation. Instead, he began to craft a new narrative. He would not be remembered as the balladeer who lost it all. He would rise again, and in doing so, he would shock everyone with the way he rebuilt his life. The scandal of divorce might have destroyed another man, but Richard Marx wasn't about to let his story end with heartbreak. Just a few years later, he stunned the world by finding love again, this time with someone as fiery and outspoken as himself. Her name was Daisy Fuentes, the Cuban-American model and MTV personality who had been a household name in the 1990s. Their relationship seemed improbable at first. Two celebrities from different corners of fame, both in their 50s, both battle-tested by the brutal cycles of Hollywood. But when Richard and Daisy went public in 2015, the shockwaves were immediate. Critics scoffed. Was this just a midlife fantasy? A desperate attempt to stay relevant? But as the months passed, it became clear. This was no fling. Richard, once wounded by whispers of infidelity and failed devotion, was suddenly writing love songs again, this time inspired by Daisy. She became his muse, his partner, his equal. In 2015, Richard and Daisy married in a secret ceremony in Aspen, Colorado. Unlike his first marriage, this one wasn't paraded for cameras or splashed across glossy magazines. It was intimate, quiet, and real. And in that simplicity, Richard found something he had long been searching for: peace. Their romance became its own scandal, not because of infidelity or betrayal, but because of how brazenly happy they appeared. Photos of the couple, arm in arm, flooded social media. Richard, older now, silver-haired but still striking, looked revitalized. Daisy, glamorous as ever, matched his energy with a confidence that turned them into a power couple for a new generation. Together, they became symbols of reinvention, proving that love doesn't have an expiration date. For Richard, it was more than companionship. It was validation. He had survived heartbreak, ridicule, and the industry's abandonment, and yet here he stood, loved, celebrated, and stronger than ever. But the story wasn't finished. As Richard entered his 60s, new battles awaited him, against age, against fading relevance, and against the very legacy that had once crowned him king. The world thought it knew Richard Marx. At 61, he was about to prove them all wrong. By the time Richard Marx turned 60, he had lived through enough triumph and turmoil for 3 lifetimes. He had sold over 30 million records, toured the world countless times, and seen his face on magazine covers from Tokyo to New York. But fame is a hungry beast, and age is its most merciless accomplice. Richard had always been defined by his looks as much as his voice. The sharp jawline, the windswept hair, the boyish charm, all were part of the package that made him a heartthrob in the late 80s. But now, at 60, he faced the mirror with a different reflection staring back. His once dark hair had turned silver, his youthful features softened by time. And yet, instead of hiding from it, Richard embraced it. Still, the public wasn't so kind. Social media buzzed with comparisons, side-by-side photos of his younger self and his current appearance, headlines dripping with disbelief. Richard Marx is 61. Try not to gasp when you see him now. Some mocked him, others praised him for aging gracefully, but the truth was undeniable. He was no longer the eternal heartthrob frozen in 1989. He was a man. But age brought more than wrinkles. It brought questions about relevance. Could a man whose biggest hits were power ballads from the late 20th century still matter in a world dominated by streaming, TikTok, and auto-tune? Many wrote him off as a nostalgia act, destined to live out his days performing "Right Here Waiting" for audiences chasing memories of youth. Richard refused to accept that fate. He battled not just the perception of irrelevance, but the physical demands of staying in the game. Years of touring had strained his voice, and maintaining his iconic tenor required relentless discipline. He adapted, changing keys, reshaping songs, proving that artistry wasn't just about hitting high notes. It was about knowing how to tell the story behind them. But the cruelest battle was internal. After decades in the spotlight, Richard faced the quiet terror of being forgotten. For a man who had once lived in the glare of universal adoration, obscurity was a fate worse than death. And yet, rather than fade, he prepared for one of the most shocking reinventions of his career. The Richard Marx of today is not the Richard Marx of yesterday, and that is exactly his power. At 60, when many artists quietly slip into retirement, he exploded with new life, using his voice not just to sing, but to speak, to argue, to fight, and to connect. He became one of the rare rock stars to master social media. On Twitter, Richard wasn't just a musician. He was a firebrand. He clashed openly with critics, sparred with politicians, and defended causes close to his heart, with the same intensity he once reserved for songwriting. Fans who had grown up with his love songs now saw a new side of him, sharp-tongued, unfiltered, and unapologetic. Some loved it, others recoiled, but no one could accuse him of irrelevance anymore. And then there was the music. Far from retreating into nostalgia, Richard released new albums, experimenting with modern sounds while staying true to his melodic roots. Collaborations with contemporary artists proved he wasn't chasing trends. He was bending them to his will. Younger audiences, discovering him through streaming, were stunned to find a man their parents had swooned over still producing music with bite. His marriage to Daisy Fuentes also became part of his reinvention. Together, they cultivated a lifestyle brand of sorts, glamorous yet authentic, playful yet grounded. They weren't just a couple. They were proof that second acts could be more thrilling than the first. But what truly defined Richard's reinvention was his refusal to be silenced. He leaned into his age instead of resisting it, turning silver hair and weathered experience into badges of honor. He wasn't trying to be the boy from 1989. He was the man who had survived the highs, the lows, the scandals, and the heartbreak, and emerged stronger. This reinvention didn't just surprise his fans, it shocked an industry that had long buried him under the label of has-been. Suddenly, Richard Marx was back, not as a relic of the past, but as a survivor who had learned how to thrive in a world that once tried to erase him. Reinvention comes with revelation, and Richard Marx seemed more willing than ever to pull back the curtain on his own life. In recent years, he began to share stories that stunned even longtime fans, confessions that painted him as both more vulnerable and more fearless than anyone realized. In interviews and in his memoir, Stories to Tell, Richard dropped bombshells about the music industry, about love, and about himself. He admitted the toll fame had taken on his first marriage, revealing the loneliness of hotel rooms and the crushing pressure of being everyone's fantasy. He confessed to insecurities that haunted him even at the height of his success. The nagging doubt that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't as good as the legends he admired. Even more shocking were his candid takes on Hollywood itself. He called out record executives, exposed industry corruption, and spoke of battles with labels that had tried to box him into a mold he refused to fit. For fans who had only ever seen the polished Richard Marx, this unvarnished truth-teller was almost unrecognizable and infinitely more fascinating. But perhaps the most surprising confessions were personal. Richard spoke openly about his mental health, about anxiety, and about the anger that once simmered beneath his calm exterior. He admitted he had been difficult to work with at times, confirming the whispers that had followed him for decades. Instead of denying it, he owned it. And in that ownership, he found liberation. These revelations did what no chart-topping single could. They made Richard Marx human again. Not the idol, not the heartthrob, not the flawless romantic, but a man who had lived, stumbled, hurt, and survived. In a world obsessed with perfection, his flaws became his most powerful confession. And as these truths spread, the narrative around Richard Marx shifted once more. He was no longer the relic of the 80s or the scandal of the 2010s. He was something far more enduring, an artist unafraid of the truth, even when it threatened to shatter the image he had built. Richard Marx, at 61, is not a man quietly fading into the pages of history. He is rewriting them. What once seemed like a career destined to be locked in the amber of the late 80s has become a living, breathing story of survival, reinvention, and unapologetic truth. Step onto one of his shows today, and you won't just find middle-aged fans reliving their youth. You'll see new generations, curious, wide-eyed, eager to understand why their parents once swooned to right here waiting. Richard no longer competes with his younger self. He embraces him, turning those classic ballads into timeless anthems that hit even harder with the weight of experience. But his legacy is no longer just about the music. It's about defiance. At an age when most stars shrink from the spotlight, Richard leans into it, unfiltered and unafraid. His social media presence alone has turned him into something of a cult figure, admired for his blunt honesty and merciless wit. He's no longer just a singer, he's a voice, a provocateur, a survivor who refuses to soften his edges to stay likable. And then there's the image itself, the one that fueled the headline, "Richard Marx is 61. Try not to gasp when you see him today." Yes, he looks different. His hair, once a lion's mane of brown, is silver now. His face bears the lines of decades lived in the harshest of spotlights. But to gasp at him today is not to see the loss of youth. It is to see the gain of endurance. He has aged not like a relic, but like a monument, weathered, dignified, unshakable. The man who once sang about eternal love has become a symbol of something greater: resilience. Richard Marx's story is proof that fame doesn't have to end with obscurity, that age doesn't mean irrelevance, and that reinvention can be more powerful than debut success. His legacy today is not just the music that made him a star, nor the scandals that nearly unmade him, nor even the reinvention that kept him alive in the cultural conversation. His true legacy is the lesson he leaves behind, that the only way to conquer time is to face it head-on, without fear, without denial, and without apology. At 61, Richard Marx is not just the man you remember. He is the man you never expected. And that is why, when you see him today, you can't help but gasp. Not because he has changed, but because he has endured. If time changes everyone, why does it feel like it has barely touched him? At 61, Richard Marx stands before us, familiar yet transformed, and the meaning lies in what we choose to see. Before the spotlight fades once more, remember, some legacies don't just survive the years, they defy them. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.